Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name's Lindsay Smith. I'm a member of the Adult Faith Formation Committee here at Montview. We're so glad to have everyone for our second Sunday in the series Paul Reimagined, a progressive lens on the apostle. I'm excited to welcome back Dr. Pamela Eisenbaum from Iliff School of Theology at DU, and we'll conclude our series next Sunday with Christy Cobb wrapping us up on Paul. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eisenbaum.
Hopefully you can't hear that vibration too much. So it's great to be back at Montview. I gotta sound like a comedian or something. Anyway, great questions last week, most of which probably pertain more to today than last time. So I hope my intention is to leave plenty of time for questions again. I think I said, for those of you who weren't here, I mentioned last time that one of my passions is when I am teaching, like a class on Paul, I usually survey my students who are mostly to the left, who would identify as progressive, how much they like Paul. And maybe one or two hands go up, and the rest of folks are just maybe enduring the class, or they have to take an ordination exam or something like that. And some have even committed, I will never preach from Paul, that sort of thing. And I make it my mission to change their mind. So I'm going to highlight some of the things you hear from traditional interpreters. So let me give you a taste of some of these things before I get to the more constructive work or the opposition research that we've done on this. So I'm sure you've heard, some of you, especially if you were raised in a conservative church or you have family members that do, the idea that women shouldn't be ordained is related to this comment, which appears in more than one place in letters ascribed to Paul, that women shouldn't be silent, they should ask their husbands, they should be submissive, subject to a husband's authority. There's also other things about how women are supposed to dress and be restrained, be modest, all that kind of stuff. And you can hear there's sort of even a revival of some of those things in, what do I want to say, in the most recent wave of conservative Christianity. And here's some other things you may have heard before, that Paul maybe is a homophobe, that Paul hates homosexuality, that it's considered an abomination, and moreover, that what used to be called fornication, sex before marriage, that also is prohibited, and the only form of acceptable sex is heterosexual sex in the confines of marriage. I stuck this one in, attributing this to the Christian right in particular, and not just traditional interpreters who wouldn't agree to all these things. But Paul is often thought of as the one, more so than Jesus. The portrait of Jesus is often as a humble person who said things like, love your enemies, reached out to people, ate with women, prostitutes, outcasts. Whereas Paul seemed like the first great missionary of the church, and that the idea was it was a sort of triumphal message of Christianity will conquer all, and a message of written exclusion as only people who have the faith of Jesus Christ, there are different forms of this, or get baptized, are saved, as the language often is in Christianity, particularly in American Christianity. So it's one of exclusion, you're either in or you're out, and also supersessionism. And if you don't know what that means, it's often used to refer to a form of Christian theology that emerges in relation to Judaism, which namely just means that Christianity superseded Judaism or Christians who received the promises of God while Jews were rejected. They no longer were in a covenant of God and that sort of thing. But the term also came to mean, starting really, I should say before the modern period, I was going to say the modern period, that Christianity is the ultimate form of religion, that all religions were sort of slowly revolving to a sort of enlightened Christianity. You can see that in a 19th century thinker, Friedrich Schleiermacher. Okay, so the first thing I want to ask or point out to address this problem, excuse me, I'm going to be swilling from I promise it's just water, is that there are many letters ascribed to Paul. And at this point in time, and by the way, actually this started with Schleiermacher, who first pointed out that certain letters couldn't possibly be written by Paul. And the ones I've listed as pseudo-Pauline, Friedrich Schleiermacher is the first one to propose, maybe Paul didn't write these. But the ones that all scholars, left, right, conservative, liberal, whether they went to Harvard or Notre Dame or Baylor University, agree that these letters, the ones I posted as undisputed, are written by Paul. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Disputed, but not so terribly far afield from Paul, Colossians, Ephesians, 2nd Thessalonians. And then the pseudo-Pauline, I've listed as those because I think we've got a 99.9% chance that Paul did not write those letters. And the reasons are not just that it sounds completely different than Paul sounds, the type of Greek he writes, the rhythm, the cadence. It would be like confusing the speeches of Barack Obama and Donald Trump. I don't think you would not have to be an expert in rhetoric if you slipped in Trump's second inaugural with Obama's. You could easily identify it as probably not. Also, it's the case that the most ancient complete manuscript of Paul's letters is missing these texts, missing. So it may be that these texts sort of nuzzle in later. They're probably from the 2nd century. Okay, by the way, I have my own doubts about 2nd Thessalonians. If anyone's interested, we could talk about that. Ephesians, I'm also pretty sure, not by Paul. Some of my colleagues think Colossians, it's a little closer to Paul's style. 2nd Thessalonians is very close to Paul's style, but the argument there is that it's so similar to 1st Thessalonians, it looked like somebody copied 1st Thessalonians. So it's a little tricky to say, oh, Paul didn't write this one because it sounds so Pauline. So that there's other reasons, but anyway, did I skip one? Oh, sorry. Okay, so let's deal with women must be submissive, should be silent, shouldn't teach in public, that sort of strain of tradition, and one that we can appeal to the issue of, or to the reasons of who wrote which letters. So in 1 Timothy, you get lots of extremely constrictive and even very negative comments about women, all of which I have not included here. I included the one with the word silence, submission, can't teach, etc. And then I've posted a text from 1 Corinthians toward the end of chapter 14 that has very, very similar language. This is the only place that Paul says women should be silent, that they shouldn't teach, that they should ask their husbands, etc. And as I pointed out with that manuscript of Paul's letters, these verses from 1 Corinthians do appear in some form of almost every manuscript of Paul's letters we have, However, it's what's called a floating text, meaning it doesn't always occur in this position in 1 Corinthians, right at this point at the end of 14. Sometimes it appears in other places. And when that happens with a text, it's very likely to be what we call an interpolation, meaning 1 Corinthians, we could say, is written by Paul, but as with any document, sometimes people, including scribes, things get in or get left out, sometimes by accident and sometimes on purpose. I think what happened here is that when a scribe is working through a passage in 1 Corinthians, and it's got some language that sort of maybe echoes 1 Timothy, scribes tend to know their biblical texts pretty well. And so this passage may well have been an insertion into 1 Corinthians to make it harmonize with 1 Timothy. This happens a lot with the Gospels. Scribes can be copying a parable in Luke that's also in Matthew, and it doesn't sound quite right because they know the version in Matthew. And they make either little corrections or notes on the side or something like that to harmonize the two. So it's not uncommon, okay? But I want to show you another reason why this doesn't make sense or may not make sense in 1 Corinthians 14. So earlier, and we're going to talk about different parts of this passage, because as you can see, Paul does have a hierarchy here. But in 1 Corinthians 11, and also the earlier parts of 1 Corinthians 14, Paul is describing how to worship properly. In fact, I think, don't Presbyterians have this thing, decently and in order? Okay, that's Pauline language. And so he doesn't want chaos in a service. And it appears that what was going on in Corinth in particular is a lot of rancor, difficulty, conflict. Paul writes some of his most angry letters, exhibits his most angry language in 2 Corinthians in particular. But furthermore, let me come back to this one again. The passage in 1 Corinthians 14, in the interest of time, I didn't make a slide and I won't go on at length. But if you were to excerpt what comes before these verses and what comes just after, they flow together beautifully, because it's all about order and praying and prophecy and whatnot. This text is clearly about how women should dress when they pray or prophesy when they come together in church. So it seems weird that in 1 Corinthians 14, he'd say women shouldn't speak, while in chapter 11, he's, whatever unlikable language there is here, he's also telling them how to dress when they speak. So it's a little bit, let's just say, just a little bit of tension there. Okay, now some of you, when it comes to submission stuff, I bet some of you have heard this, maybe many of you have heard this language. I once heard it at a Christian wedding, which surprised me. But this bit about wives be subject to your husbands, the husband's the head of the wife, Christ is the head of the church, that sort of language. There are actually, this is what scholars of Paul called a household code. They seem to come from sort of other, general Greek ethics of the time, something like that, about how to, it derives from Aristotle, how to maintain an orderly household. But Paul has Christianized them, to be sure. But there's three things that follow this format. 3 times this happens in your New Testament. One is in Ephesians, one is in Colossians, and one is in 1 Peter, not even in Paul. So if you were to just take the undisputed letters, this language, I'm going to accept where I showed you in 1 Corinthians 11, this business about the husband is the head of the wife and that sort of thing, including, these also include slaves be subject to your masters, wives, children to parents, etc. These household codes, these rigorous sort of things, those are found in Ephesians, Colossians, and 1 Peter, not in any of the undisputed epistles. So I want to look a little more closely at this passage in 1 Corinthians 11, because here I have highlighted some of the language that does sound, that echoes those household codes that I just showed you in Ephesians, except Paul doesn't put it in the form of a household code. Okay, so here again we're in that passage where Paul is teaching people largely how to dress appropriately in church. Maybe that, for some of us who are a little older, we might have heard that, or synagogue in my case. Okay, so Paul does use that language. I can't make that go away. From everything I can tell, that's absolutely authentic. I can't magically make that go away. But I also want to highlight that a few verses later, Paul does something very, very interesting. So when he says, "For a man ought not to have his head veiled," in this section, Paul really wants, or seems to kind of want, we don't really know what it means, a woman to wear a head covering, maybe kind of sort of some sort, to be veiled, which would be traditional at this time, and for men to not be veiled, okay? Which may already tell you there may be some cross-dressing going on in 1 Corinthians, because normally when somebody has to say this, it means it's a problem already, but in any case. So he says, so man, he is the image and reflection of God, but a woman is the reflection of man. But then he goes on to say these things: man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man. I want you to think Genesis there. When God creates Eve, he puts Adam to sleep, and he creates someone who is going to become Adam's helper, and that's what she's called, and companion. And so I'm certain that's what he's thinking of here. He's evoking Genesis. Then he goes on with this very weird passage about a woman ought to have a symbol of authority. That's not what it says, but we can't really make sense of what it says because of the angels. Nevertheless, here's what's really remarkable. In the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, which he said just above, so man comes through woman, meaning ordinary childbirth now. So I'm not saying he's a big feminist here, but this is an extraordinary thing for Paul to say within his time. And I'm going to point to another passage we'll come to in a little bit. I also want to point out that Paul, this whole business in particular about being submissive to your husbands, etc., silent, not teaching, whatever, that Paul has a lot of female friends and colleagues. We know that both from his own letters and from the book of Acts. At the end of Romans, Paul, the last chapter of Romans is a very personal chapter. It's the part where Paul says hi to all his friends, basically, and also mentions a little bit about what he's been doing with other friends he's been traveling with. And he introduces this section of Romans with a woman named Phoebe and asks them to welcome her in the Lord, that she's a deacon and she's also been Paul's benefactor, helping him do his work. And that means that Phoebe was the carrier of the letter from where Paul wrote it to the church or churches in Rome, okay? Prisca and Aquila, sometimes it said Priscilla and Aquila, these are two people mentioned several times in Paul's letters and also in the book of Acts. And usually Priscilla's name comes first. The last and most interesting example I want to highlight is Eunia. Eunia is also mentioned at the end of Romans. And Eunia is someone that's clearly been working with Paul. She's not in Rome. But in older English translations of the Bible, and even our older critical editions of our Greek text, the ones scholars work with to make translations, Eunia is not listed as Eunia, which is a female name. It reads Eunius, which is a male name, traditional male name. And the reason scholars did that was they assumed, against the manuscript evidence, that no woman would have been an apostle. They just took it for granted somehow that that was impossible. And then a famous, in fact, male scholar who did a lot of technical work on manuscripts pointed out this was an absurd argument because lots of ancient manuscripts read Eunia, the female name, and call her a preeminent apostle. Okay, now I want to go to 1 Corinthians 7. I want to turn to sexuality. In 1 Corinthians 7, which is one of the most interesting chapters in all the Pauline letters, I think, this is about sexuality, marriage, divorce, those kinds of children, having children, to not have children, that sort of thing. And it begins this way. It is well for a man not to touch a woman, but because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. He's going to go on later to say you don't have to have a wife or husband, it's fine. But if you do, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, not a surprising thing to say, but it goes on. But the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. It then goes on to talk about if you want to abstain from sex, it should be by mutual agreement. There is no other text in antiquity, and I have studied lots of other classical texts and other Christian texts. There's nothing that sounds like this. For Paul to say that a husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but a wife does, is extraordinary. And there are lots of other extraordinary things Paul says in this chapter, including citing a text by Jesus that one shouldn't get divorced. He cites that text and he goes on to say, but you know what, we know people say, things happen. Things happen and it's okay. I'm paraphrasing very loosely. You shouldn't force people to stay if they want to go. And if you need to go, you need to go. And in order to make this point, he literally overturns a teaching of Jesus, okay? You could say he's more liberal on this question. Okay, now, for perhaps the most challenging stuff for us. Paul the homophobe. I'm going to start with a little verse from 1 Corinthians 6 that gets held up all the time by very conservative fundamentalist Christians. They cite this particular text where Paul cites a bunch of inappropriate types of people, and he often does this where he goes on a list of sins or something. You shouldn't do that sort of thing. And we have this in Greek rhetoric too. And often there are things like, here you see thieves, below the yellow, thieves, greedy, drunkards, etc. These texts, a lot of the other ancient Greek ones I've looked at, read similarly for those kinds of things to Paul's, and it appears to be the sort of, that people in ethical treatises just sort of said this sort of thing. It's sort of like, we can all agree that you shouldn't do this, 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 this. It's sort of like, nobody would really argue about driving drunk, right? You would just don't drive drunk. So it was considered a common attitude. But not the language we have here of fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, and sodomites. So the first thing you should know, and I looked up other translations of this, and it's really problematic. So fornicators is just the word that people who engage in porneia, and really that sort of means any kind of sexually deviant behavior by the standards of the day, presumably. Notice that idolaters, that is people who worship other gods, is inserted between sexual immorality, I'd say, or people who deviate from common practice, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, it's embedded in there. Adulterers, not unexpected. Now, the word for male prostitutes, I put the Greek at the bottom, malakoi, it literally means soft ones, and was used to refer to an effeminate male. And the word sodomites, which is really objectionable, I think, in translations, but it literally means the Greek, Paul sort of invented this word. Or if he didn't invent it, we don't have any texts preserved that use this word, but he appears to have sort of amalgamated or created a neologism, a particular term, based on some language in Leviticus in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So again, this is one of, it probably malakoi, soft ones. I don't know that it really refers to prostitutes, though I think there might be some other texts where you could read it that way, or effeminate men. Again, I can't really make this language nicer, so I want to be candid. And the one that sodomites really just means, if I were to translate it literally, men who sleep with other men. Some people read the male prostitutes and sodomites as sort of male prostitutes being the passive partner in sex, and sodomites, God, I'd say the Greek word, but it's multisyllabic there because I hate sodomites so much. But in any case, as being the active partner, and some will translate those two words together as homosexual in conservative translations. So there it is. I can't make that nice, by the way, except that I'm going to show you in a minute the fact that idolatry is stuck in there. Paul, like any good Jew of his day, thinks idolatry is the sin of sin. And even in the Hebrew Bible itself, idolatry is often linked to adultery or inappropriate sexual behavior. Some of the prophets have very disturbing language of this kind of thing. The idea that Israel went whoring after other gods, that kind of thing. It's likened to adultery, that kind of thing. So those things sort of go together in Paul's mind. And remember, he's writing to non-Jews, formerly pagans, worshipers of other gods. Okay, here's the worst text of the New Testament for dealing with same-sex relations. Here we have, one thing that's interesting about this, though, is Paul begins with women, not men. We have hardly any references to same-sex relationships among women. But here Paul states what you can read right there. Yeah, there you go. So let me say with both of these, before I move on to the idolatry thing and get us moving along so you can ask questions. Both in the previous slide and in this one, I don't think Paul is thinking very much about same-sex relationships. I think he's really throwing this language together. That's the first thing. The second thing is, many scholars who know more than I do about sexuality in antiquity think that models of same-sex relations, particularly among men in antiquity, were often not exactly the kind of relationships we have in the modern period, and having the notion of someone having a kind of sexual orientation that is who they are, not just what they do, is pretty different. I mean, it's just something we could talk about in antiquity being different from our own culture. So some have argued what really Paul is condemning here is abusive relationships. I don't know whether I'm completely convinced of that, but it's got some merit. So this verse also is what it is. I won't go into too much more exegesis of that. But let me just say, that passage comes right in the middle of Paul excoriating the Gentiles in Rome for their worship of other gods. So you can see some of that here. I won't read it. Then it continues in verses 24 and 25, and we have this language of God giving them up in the lusts of their hearts. And then we get to Romans 1:26 and 1:27. So the point, if you were to say, what's the upshot of what Paul's talking about in Romans 1? I would say he's railing against idolatry as many Jews of his age did. He's kind of a chauvinist about this. He's not a religious pluralist the way we would hope for today. So finally, triumphalism, exclusion, and supersessionism. So here are the things some people associate with Paul. Paul's the beginning of the missionary enterprise. I said that with the goal of making everyone Christian. There's no tolerance for dissent. We know that eventually Christianity becomes obsessed with heresy and heretics. Not all religions do that way, okay? So is that what Paul was like? So let me just tell you about, and I have to paraphrase, not give you quotes because it's too long. So let me tell you about another passage where Paul is talking about idolatry. In 1 Corinthians, remember in Corinth, this is the most conflictual congregation Paul deals with. There's a long section where Paul speaks to the question of whether meat that has been sacrificed to idols can be consumed by members of the church. And by the way, when I say members of the church, that's church with a small c. Paul doesn't ever use it in the sort of sense of Catholic church or a theological church. Now, this debate goes on for quite a while, or his language, and he sort of debates it even with himself. It appears that in Corinth, some people thought it was perfectly fine to buy meat that had been purchased, that had been sacrificed to idols, as long as you don't believe in idols. Other people said no, it was a sacrilege to eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols. It's just like committing idolatry. Goes through a whole rigmarole. In the end, Paul says this: I agree with those who think it doesn't really matter if you eat meat sacrificed to idols, if you know, your conscience says to you, there are really no other gods. So he believes that's the sort of theologically correct position. But then he goes on to say, but you know what? That doesn't matter. Because if members of your community believe that it does, and it signals to others that we worship other gods, or we think we can worship these gods and Jesus, it's unfair to people who are offended. He has an argument like this in Romans as well. What I'm trying to say is that it surprises me how often Paul does not favor being theologically correct or having the correct doctrine, but rather not putting, to use Pauline language, not putting a stumbling block with your neighbors, and that we can actually live with different beliefs, and we should do for the others what they need. It's actually kind of inspiring passage in Paul. So is the one in Romans. So let me just conclude so I have time for questions. the various ways one can draw out the progressive Paul without, I think, covering over those passages that say things many of us find very ethically objectionable and don't comport with contemporary values, including the values of Montview Presbyterian Church. So the first is one, authorship. If I were to take out all those disputed letters, you have to look pretty hard to find the passages where Paul says negative things about women. There are some. I showed you a couple passages in 1 Corinthians, but otherwise, Paul's letters, he's working with women, he's doing things with women, women are preaching, women are traveling, which is already a big deal, that sort of thing. So if you care whether Paul wrote something or didn't write something, because the other letters are still in your New Testament, that also distinguishes one from the other, because those other letters have lots of negative things to say about women. You can't miss them, okay? Another is context. While Paul says what he says in Romans, for example, the context of where his emphasis is very different. Paul is not obsessing about same-sex relations. One has also to distinguish between Paul himself and how we read him ethically and with some historical sensibility, and his interpreters. I also like to remind myself that Paul didn't create Christendom in its most triumphalist mode in converting the whole world with the Crusades, etc. Paul didn't create that. He thought the world would have ended long before then. Paul didn't create systems of oppression. He attempted to navigate within them. And again, I mentioned historical honesty and ethical commitments. Sometimes I think we on the left want to gloss over Paul's comments, and I don't think that's historically honest. Okay, I didn't even tell you all the good passages we could look to because I was focused on the negative rather than the positive. But there you go. How about if we do some questions? Thanks. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I barely know what I'm talking about, but I'm just going to try. So I have the impression that there was conflict between James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and Paul, and that there was great diversity in early Christianity, and that's reflected in all the books that didn't make it into the Bible. And the Bible is tough and problematic and, requires so much thought, and I sometimes feel like it's a little elusive, and maybe we just have to stick with the love rule when it's confusing, because I don't know that we'll ever know definitively how, some of these things. But am I right that there was a lot of diversity in thought, and there was conflict and...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Absolutely. I think some people have the impression, and perhaps more conservative Christians do this more, we're going to get back to the original church. Actually, I think progressive churches sometimes, we're going to get back to the original message. There is no original. There just is. There was conflict and different ideas about what to do from our earliest texts of the New Testament. That's evident. And also, when you think about, let's just take Jesus preaching the Sermon on the Mount. I actually think it's not one sermon, it's probably more like his greatest hits, but okay, let's just say it's a single sermon. Even if that was the case, and even if somehow, I don't know, we knew those were Jesus' words in some form, the only way those words were preserved was by memory. There were no journalists there, taping it, there's nobody taking notes. And so when you have an audience like all of you here, like they're standing in the, watching Jesus on a mount preach, hopefully there's some overlap. Like if I were to interview you going out, what did I just say? What was my main point of this talk? Hopefully there'd be some overlap, but there'd be lots of difference because what you hear sounds different, even if you all heard the same talk, based on who you are, what your background is, what stood out. And yes, there's lots of conflict in the New Testament, representing different views.
I kind of have two questions. One dealing with language. And all the different languages at that time that were spoken. And Paul must have been multilingual to quite an extent. Is that the case?
Actually, I think he knows a little bit of Hebrew, like to study it, because he would have studied the Bible as a Pharisee, and he knows his Bible. Greek at this point, especially in this part of the Mediterranean, is the lingua franca of the day. So people who live in cities, not necessarily rural people who are still speaking vernaculars, are more and more speaking Greek. And that goes back to the time of Alexander, a few centuries before. Eventually, Latin is going to dominate in the Western Mediterranean. But there's no evidence. So I suppose he could have, but there's no evidence that he spoke any other languages.
So it was mainly Greek that he was...
All of the New Testament is originally written in Greek, despite what you hear. There's actually no evidence. There are lots of translations in many languages subsequently made in a relatively short period of time, but there's no evidence that the writer of the Gospel of John, Paul's letters, the pseudo-Pauline letters, that they were written in anything other than Greek.
My other question is about Jesus. Now, Paul was a great writer, and many of the scholars wrote lots of things. There's nothing that apparently Jesus wrote. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it was not uncommon, so I don't think we need to assume that Jesus is illiterate, but most teaching and learning is done in an oral setting, face-to-face, teacher and student. So orality is the dominant form of media, even among the educated. But of course, there's lots of people writing philosophical treatises and lots of letters as well. And so it's true that Paul writes letters, but why does he write letters? He writes letters because he's traveling, preaching the gospel. He's traveling around. And what happens is, let's say he's preaching in Thessaloniki, the message, it all goes well. Then he goes on to Philippi. But then, we see this in 1 Thessalonians, something happens in the congregation in Thessaloniki, and they want to get word to Paul. They maybe want him to come back, but he can't or he won't or whatever. It's not so easy to travel, right? So he writes letters answering their questions. So I don't think he thought, I'm going to write a lot of letters and hopefully there'll be scripture one day. I think he just wrote letters to communicate with people who asked him questions. In fact, I don't know if you remember, but in that 1 Corinthians 7 passage, it begins, now concerning the matters you wrote. That looks like, and then he quotes a line, that's probably what he read, what the people in Corinth said, not what Paul said, but then he responds to what they said. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you to participate in a little fiction here, but I'm wondering, Paul obviously isn't writing to create some foundational philosophical belief system, but he also thinks he's got, maybe 50 years until everything's done, right? If somebody convinces Paul, you got another millennia upon millennia upon millennia of this thing going on, do you think he changes anything he says?
Yes, yes, I do.
And what do you think that would be?
Yes, I think, and I didn't mention that last time or this time, Paul thinks the end of the world is coming soon. From his first letter till his last letter, he thinks the end of the world is coming soon. In Romans, when he writes, I thought the end would be here already, but I guess the Lord has delayed. I still don't think he thinks it's eternity. It's just timeline he has to adjust. And Romans is a text, you could say, that's very ethical, that's very flexible ethically in some ways, maybe of all his letters. And also there's a statement on how to behave under Roman rule that actually sounds pretty conservative. So I actually think that, yes, if Paul thought there'd be extended time, he would have given, because he's not writing a systematic ethical philosophy, right? Just as you said. He would have given different advice. In 1 Corinthians, in that same chapter about sexuality, marriage, divorce, it has some teachings about whether or not you should have children. And Paul says, I wouldn't recommend it because there's a lot of trauma that could be coming. However, he says, if you want to have sex, by the way, Paul never thought procreation was the reason for sex. He didn't think, he actually says, lust is the reason for sex. So I think he probably would have said, God said, be fruitful and multiply. It's not the end of time. That's what God said for this creation. You should have children. So, yeah, I do think so. That's a great question. Thanks.
This might actually be a question for our pastors, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it too. There's been such an ethical shift in our generation and in the last few generations, both around feminism, of course, but also how we welcome and include the LGBTQ community into our midst, and as progressive Christians. And it's such a beautiful shift in our lives, in our homes. In my own family, and I know this is true for many other people at Montview, my teenagers have a hard time engaging with Christianity because of the homophobia that they see in the world being propagated by Christians. Where do we find the value in sharing and understanding Paul and reading Paul, like when there is such kind of horrible homophobia there in the text? I feel like it's a little bit like brownies, right? Like if I have a brownie that has just a little bit of manure in it, I still don't want to eat that brownie. And I feel like that's what my teenagers are experiencing when they come to Christianity. We're like, no, our church is progressive. No, we welcome everybody. And they're like, well, but you're just ignoring those parts. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of speak to that. Where's the ethic of how do we engage honestly with these texts and this history of our faith tradition, and yet welcome in our own children and even our own doubts about where do we fit into this?
Right. Thank you for that question, because I didn't exactly end on an inspiring note. Maybe this gives me a chance. So first of all, I think the Bible, both yours, Christians, and mine, says it's a living text. In Judaism, there's a famous rabbi who once said, by a living text, it means every generation should have new and creative interpretations. And by the way, he was an Orthodox rabbi. When he said that, he was complaining that his students just kept repeating what he said. And he thought they needed to say something new because times change, etc. Now, I don't think the best strategy is just to pretend it's not in there, close the book, make sure no one reads it. I don't think that's a good idea. But I do think the work of interpretation, first, I think confronting it head on, There are lots of things in the Bible we do not like. Purity laws. I mean, frankly, if I can say this, hopefully it won't sound like chastisement. Christians rejected a lot of the prescriptions in the Old Testament. To say a lot is a big understatement. So there are lots of things in the Bible that reflect a time and people's beliefs of that time that don't reflect what we do now. And I would argue that for conservative Christians, they're picking and choosing as well. And often with not much hermeneutical sophistication if you know what they're doing. So I think one is to be honest, but to counterbalance that with other things. Both Jesus and Paul do have a message of love. Jesus also said, I've come to bring a sword, and Jesus actually says several disturbing things, I might add. But I wouldn't say that's his primary message, and I wouldn't say that's Paul's primary message. You know, the text I more commonly hear at Christian weddings is 1 Corinthians 13, and that beautiful passage, it brings tears to my eyes. I wish we had it in our Bible. And so I don't think, you know, you have to take the bad with the good. I have the advantage of being a professor and not a preacher, not a religious leader. I think that's more challenging. But I think there's ways to do it. I do. Thank you for that question. I don't know if we have more time or not. It's 10:30.
We're at 10:30. Let's just offer our gratitude for Dr. Eisenbaum today.
Thank you. I can hang around a little bit if people have
Great.
urgent
I
questions.
think our choir needs to go, but if you're available to just have
Sure.
a few Q&A. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you for being here.